Welcome to the Apocalyptic Supperclub, where I serve up stories to whet the appetite for the politically possible and nourish our capacity to show up more fully in a drastically changing world. I am your host, Christine Barrington. My guest today is a giant in the world of urban anthropology, and her research arc is essentially a 50-year diary of global resistance. Ida Susser is a distinguished professor of anthropology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of City University, New York. And for nearly half a century, she's been on the front lines studying how regular people survive, resist, and reclaim their power in the face of massive systemic change. She has just released what many are saying is one of the most important field guides for 21st century civic engagement, and it's called The Yellow Vests and the Battle for Democracy, taking to the streets of Paris in the 21st century. While the world watched France from afar, she was on the ground at the roundabouts documenting a movement that didn't just ask for change, it demanded it by breaking the rules of politics as usual. She's here to tell us how we can take those lessons and apply them to our own communities. So, Ida, thank you so much for joining me on the Apocalyptic Supperclub.
Thank you.
Ida, I'm really excited to have you on the show. The more I researched the scope of your work, the more I understood how much you have to offer at this critical juncture in history. Your book just hit the shelves in April, and one reviewer said something that really stuck with me. He said, "This is a magnificent book, ringing with hope." And then he went on to state that we're at this axial moment in history, and your work presents a way to break the pendulum's swing. In America right now, so many of us feel trapped on that pendulum. So it's my intention, Ida, on the show to have the following question answered through your work. How do we stop being spectators, watching that pendulum swing, and start becoming, as you put it, the protagonists of our own history and seize the momentum of that pendulum for ourselves? Because if more of us aren't involved in caring about our society and each other, we are doomed to be like little monkeys swinging on that pendulum that you speak of and never driving that arc to where we want it to be.
Yes, exactly.
I'm so tired of listening to shows and they're talking about what is wrong and they're not painting a clear picture that people can see themselves in that is building toward not only solutions, but societal transformation.
Yeah, that's exactly why I wrote the book. That's exactly what I had in mind. I mean, people are so depressed. My students are so depressed. I've lived long enough. You see that things can change, but you have to show people.
Yeah, so we're going to get into it. Ida, you've been in the room and on the streets for some of the most pivotal moments of the last 50 years. From the fiscal crises in 1970s Brooklyn to the fight for life-saving medicines during the AIDS epidemic in South Africa, and much, much more. Most of us are used to hearing about these movements from unsatisfactory media feeds that are driven by the 24-hour news cycle. But you approach this as an anthropologist. What does that anthropological lens allow you to see about the power of regular people that the pundits and the pollsters almost always miss?
Well, that's a great question. I'm happy to talk about that. I went into anthropology because it allowed me to just go out and talk to people. It allowed me to follow processes. I wasn't so interested in grand theory within anthropology because, as you may know, anthropology studies many, many different things. But at the time that I began working, it wasn't so much focused on industrial or capitalist societies. And I thought, but it will give me the chance to go beyond the news cycle, just what you were saying. It'll give me the chance to go beyond the surveys. The trouble with surveys and some of those kind of things is they capture one moment at one time, and the way you divide people up, your categories, are going to give you your answers. So I don't diss those things. I use them all the time. I think about them all the time. I think it's a complementary exercise, and I think I need to understand those things. However, the reason I started this work back in the 70s, as you mentioned, with the fiscal crisis, because at that time, Nixon was in power and he kept talking about something called the silent majority. Now, what is that? I mean, seriously, if they're silent, who are they? And why does he claim to be speaking for them? So I was very upset about Nixon because he was cutting all the programs for the poor. He was beginning to destroy the social safety net. He was expanding the war in Vietnam. So where was this silent majority, which he was really, really whispering, was some group that were anti-poor, anti-immigrant, anti-people of color. This silent majority was his whisper to people against social change and people against the population that was asking for justice, social justice. So that was his silent majority. And I wanted to know, was it true? So I didn't know how to go about it. But as an anthropologist, I thought about it. I said, I'll go, because he's kind of talking to the white working class. That's his silent majority, the people that maybe they're being displaced. They think they might be, with all the social movements for affirmative action and the social movements for food stamps and for good health care. So let me see. I'll go and talk to a very well-known working class white area. And I went to a part of Brooklyn, which at that time was majority white working class, had the biggest amount of industry in New York City. And it was Greenpoint and Williamsburg, which was seen as a backwater. It was very much a white working class neighborhood. And it was white landlords who actually were racially discriminatory. So other people couldn't move in. And I documented that. However, I wanted to know, were this population supporting Nixon? Were they the people that were going to be the silent majority? So I went into this neighborhood right after Nixon had already done all his fraud and criminality and resigned. So Ford was in power. And because of Nixon and Ford cutting all the welfare programs, they cut the model cities, which Johnson had put in place. They cut the women and infant children foods. They cut the public health programs, the well baby clinics. They cut all the things that were funded at the national level. And suddenly New York went bankrupt because they had been living in the Johnson world where, yes, he went to war in Vietnam, which we all were against and which I participated in protesting. However, on the other side, he was providing all this money for the cities. New York City, Chicago, Denver, all the big cities were getting money from the federal government to help build social structure. So that was shut down all at once by Nixon and then Ford. Shut down. And what happened? New York, like, who had been living on that money for good reason, they had the very, very many poor people, suddenly was in debt without any warning. They were suddenly in debt. Of course, they got blamed. The mayors were told they were irresponsible. They said the Democrats were irresponsible. They said the administrators were irresponsible. Nobody took into account that this had been an absolute turnabout at the federal level. That's what that moment is famous for. Ford to city drop dead, when the city went bankrupt. And I studied that neighborhood.
So what, I'm going to press the pause button. So what you're saying is there was a headline, Ford says to the city, drop dead.
Exactly. It was a very famous statement. There's a movie about it now. Even the movie never points out what I just did about how the Johnson administration had supported the cities, that the mayors were not idiots, that they were following what was being built, which was a new society. And suddenly this was slapped in the face. So that Ford to city drop dead meant that the city went into fiscal crisis. The firehouses were closed. The baby clinics were closed. The libraries were closed. The schools were cut back. The teachers were fired. Like 1 million city workers were fired suddenly in 1975. And I thought, oh my God, this is what I have to follow on the ground. What are people feeling? And this, as I told you, was a white working class neighborhood. So I went there. And I got an apartment, because that's what anthropologists do. They just go and live somewhere and try to find someone to talk to them. And after a few weeks, I saw a notice saying, come to this meeting. We're discussing How are we going to save the firehouse? It was just a little notice on a window. It wasn't even in the newspaper, which I followed all the time. So I went, and it was these young women, mothers, who were not politicians. They had talked to the firemen, and listen to this, the people in the firehouse, the firemen were only men. They had already been cut back, and they wanted to go on strike, but they got the neighborhood to support them. So these young women decided that they were going to get together people to occupy a firehouse and to keep the firehouse open, along with the Firemen's Union, which was, not necessarily a very progressive union. Like, they hadn't let any women in, but they wanted to keep their firehouse open. So they worked with a working class community. And we all had to sign a piece of paper that we would join. And suddenly we all got phone calls one day, and we all went and occupied the firehouse. And it was occupied for 2 years. They kept it open. And it was never shut down. And you can still go there. It's not a firehouse anymore, but there's a commemoration. And it was the beginning, to me, of local struggles fighting back. And there were many other occupations. There was an occupation of a firehouse in Bushwick, which was a Black neighborhood. There was many other occupations in which Black and white and Latina and all other kinds of New York working class got together to occupy, and they were living in this firehouse with the firemen. It became very famous. So I found that, I followed it, and that's part of what I wrote the book about. To me, that was the biggest shock, the crisis for New York, the neoliberal turn, we call it now. That was the moment where everything was shut down, everything turned around, which I saw again, really only with the Trump regime.
This would be an appropriate moment to ground the term neoliberalism. I've been asking around, and it turns out most people are muddy in their understanding of the term because of the tricky way it uses the term liberalism. While social liberalism focuses on social justice, inclusion, and a government safety net, neoliberalism focuses almost entirely on market freedom, where the rich get richer and the vulnerable get sidelined. If you want to spot neoliberalism in the wild, look for three main strategies: privatization, deregulation, and austerity. Privatization moves services out of government hands and into the private sector. Deregulation removes or reduces the rules that govern businesses and agencies meant to protect us. Austerity means the government cuts spending on social programs, ostensibly to lower taxes and reduce the national debt. Which brings us to the Yellow Vests of France, a decentralized, multiracial, cross-cultural, and cross-political movement that actively involved hundreds of thousands of people. In 2018, 21% of the French populace self-identified as Yellow Vests, and more than 70% of the population viewed their cause favorably. I asked Ida to describe the roots of the movement and what inspired her to plant herself among its adherents.
I think most of your listeners would have heard of Occupy. And Occupy was one kind of movement which was largely students and young people, largely, not altogether. And they were objecting to the debt, right? What they were thinking about was the 2008 crisis that led to huge loss of housing and huge debts on the part of everybody in the United States and in the world, and led to what now we call austerity. It's a cutback in everything that you're entitled to. So that was the background. 2008, the crash, then Occupy was the first movement. So then a few years later, 2018, November 2018, 300,000 people across France came into the central cities. Most of them came into Paris from the urban periphery, as we call it. You know that rich people live in the middle of the city, and working class can't really afford to live in the city anymore. And that is true of French cities too. So they were coming from what we call the urban periphery, the places where people could still afford to live and work in the city. So those were where the Yellow Vests came from all over France. And they had been demonstrating in the provincial areas outside Paris. They had taken over traffic circles, what we call traffic circles. And they had built cabins, they called them cabanas, in these traffic circles. And every day they had gone there to hang out with each other and talk about their problems. And then they said, nobody's noticing us. We built these traffic circles and we're not even on the news. So they decided to meet in Paris on November 17th. And this was like a historic moment. And it was a shock. People who in their lives had never been to Paris, had never demonstrated, had never had a political moment, suddenly came rushing into Paris, rushing, breaking windows, running down the streets, no permits to march, always down the middle of the street. They didn't even hardly had banners. They were wearing these yellow vests. And they were running through the streets. And what did they know about Paris? They'd heard of the Arc de Triomphe, just like you people probably heard of the Arc de Triomphe. Didn't even know how to find it. They had to keep asking the way. And they went to the Arc de Triomphe. And off the Arc de Triomphe, you probably have heard, is the Champs-Élysées, which is the richest shopping district in France, probably in the world, because France has the most important fashion industry in the world. So they ran up to the Arc de Triomphe. And they ran through the streets, stopping all the traffic, breaking windows, turning over motorbikes, turning over cars, a lot of things. And it was unbelievable. People were terrified. Nobody around the world knew what was happening. And then I went to Paris because of this, because I was following social movements. I didn't know what it was. But there was this debate right from the start, November 17th. The only political party that supported the Yellow Vests at that time was the National Legacy Fascist Extreme Right movement, fascists, which is led by Marine Le Pen. Mm-hmm. So people were terrified. I mean, all these working class, displaced people, just like the people that I knew in Brooklyn, actually. And they were like truck drivers and nurses and teachers and secretaries. Many of them had white hair. And they brought their children and they were running through the streets. They were old. They were not your college students that usually demonstrate. That wasn't who was in this movement at all. So it was a very unusual movement in France. They never saw anything like it. And people were not sure what it was. Rage is open to anything. And how is this going to be harnessed? By which kind of politics? By which political leaders? And the most important thing that I think ever happened about the Yellow Vests is that they were horizontalist. Horizontalist means they didn't believe in choosing leaders. If anyone came up and thought they were a leader, the Yellow Vests would ignore them and push them away. They wouldn't vote for them. They didn't want leaders. They didn't believe in political parties. So first Marine Le Pen tried to adopt them, but they didn't jump on her bandwagon. Like, that's the biggest difference I see between the angry politics in the US who followed Trump and the angry politics in France, which was from the grassroots. And if you understand the Tea Party, they used to call the Tea Party AstroTurf. It was sponsored and funded by senators on the right a lot. You can read books about it. There's a Harvard woman that wrote a very good book about that.
Over the years, as I've watched politics and I've looked at movements, I often thought one of the biggest weaknesses is having an incredible leader. You can love John Kennedy, you can love Dr. King, you can love Bobby Kennedy, you can love Malcolm X, and all they have to do is chop them down like a mighty oak. And everybody's sheltering under their shade, and then they all scatter. And in my mind, what I saw, instead of the oak, we need the mycelial network. Just all these mushrooms through the forest, and they can mow down entire swaths, and there's always going to be more mushrooms. So please go on.
That was exactly the principle behind the Yellow Vests. If they had a principle, that was it. And also it came from the ground up. I mean, this came from no party and no unions. It came from people in the villages who were opposed to a gas tax because the gas tax was going to be mostly affecting them. Because of all the things that I mentioned to you about the cutbacks in healthcare, the cutbacks in education, in most areas of France today, they used to have buses and they used to have trains. They no longer have them out to the rural areas. You have to have a car. They used to have a bakery and a post office and a butcher and in each little village. Those villages don't have a single shop or cafe anymore, and they don't have really good bus service. So if you're taking your child to school, You're really, really lucky if there's a school for ages, say, 4 and 5. But after that, you have to drive them to the nearest town, maybe 20 miles away. So you've got to have a car. The poorest people have to have cars. And they bought diesel cars because diesel tax was cheapest and it had not been taxed. So suddenly, Macron, the president, taxed diesel. And that was for the poor people. And they had bought those very cheap cars on purpose. And now they were going to be taxed. And they were outraged. So that's how it started. It started in the provinces.
Ordinary people creating change under extraordinary conditions has been the study of Ida Susser for decades. As an American anthropologist, she has traveled the world embedding herself in communities to study the revolutionary spirit from Brooklyn to apartheid South Africa, Spain, and now France. She brings it all home at a time when America is reeling from devastating attacks to constitutional freedoms and the rule of law. When those with the privilege of leadership consistently fail the people, eventually the people awaken, arise, and organize to stand for what they value and what they desperately need. The awakening here in the United States is really just beginning, but in France, it came to a head in November of 2018, and there is much we can learn from their efforts described in my guest's book, The Yellow Vests and the Battle for Democracy. This is the Apocalyptic Supper Club. I am your host, Christine Barrington. When times are dire, we must be fed with nourishing stories to feed our hearts and bolster our political imagination. One way we do that is by learning from those who have stood up to power and won. Anthropologist Ida Susser lived among the Yellow Vests of France as they occupied the roundabouts and public spaces, demanding to be seen and heard in the face of devastating austerity measures that reached a climax with a tax on diesel fuel. My understanding is Macron levied that tax as an environmental move.
Well,
right?
that was what they said exactly. But when you examine what Macron was going to do with that money, only less than a quarter was going to go for environmental issues. Only less than a quarter. So he said that he was levying it for environmental, and he said that the Yellow Vests were ignorant and that they were anti-ecological and they were anti-environmental. And many, many people, journalists, believed it too, that they were ignorant. So they were furious. And then they came into the cities. And then very soon, within the next few months, they were called anti-Semitic. They were called racist. They were called anti-everything you can imagine. They were called fascist. So they were immediately branded by the government as the enemy. And people were terrified. And that's why I wanted to find out what was going on.
Label and dismiss. It is a proven technique that the powerful lean on when troublesome groups speak up and demand change. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard stated, "When you label me, you negate me." The label becomes a wall, and once the label is applied, the person behind it no longer needs to be listened to. They only need to be managed, dismissed, or defeated. It's a form of political spell casting that brands entire groups, precluding any serious discussion of their demands in the media or the public forum. It often works, but the Yellow Vests were hard to define and label, as Ida describes here.
This guy called Mélenchon, who runs for president, very well known in France. He's like the socialist who could win in France. So he's really our French Bernie Sanders. That's who he is. And, of course, they brand him in France as extreme left. You never see his name in Le Monde, which is like the New York Times, unless it says extreme left. And then they say there's the extreme left, which is him, and the extreme right, which is the fascist, Marine Le Pen. And we have to hold on to the middle. So Mélenchon, within a few weeks, recognized that Yellow Vests were grassroots. It was a grassroots, poor working people's struggle. And he supported it. and he came out in favor. So the two parties, were the far right and the left, came out in support of the yellow vests. And there were many, many leftists in those movements, activists from all over France. So they came into the city, and the question was, which way would it turn? And that was what my book is about. And what I would say is that when people came into the city, they had never thought about politics before. It was the first demonstration most of these people had ever been on. And they had met in the traffic circles day after day, poor people, mothers who can't feed their children, disabled people, people of different backgrounds, people who were immigrants. And they had met like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, bringing like sliced bread, and they had a barbecue, bringing cheap sausages, bringing bits of cheese, not what you think of French cheese, which I love, but cheap sliced cheese.
Well, you've spent decades looking at these patterns, but you always go into the communities. And I'm wondering, when you were actually sitting with some of these people on the roundabouts, is there something when you look back on it that you could imagine saying, like, I want the people of New York, I want the people of the Rust Belt to see this? What would be the thing you would want them to see?
Well, that is such an interesting thought. So what I would say is it was talking to their neighbors and learning that they're not the only ones who are struggling. Like from the end of the month, they ran out of money and food at the end of the month. The end of the month was terribly important to them. And they were embarrassed that their children were living on cornflakes or whatever. They were embarrassed that they couldn't pay the rent. They were embarrassed that the local hospital was no longer available to treat them for their illnesses. And they came together and found that they were not the only ones. And that the one thing about the yellow vest was, if you put on a yellow vest, we will talk to you. We respect you. You are one of us. That's all you had to do. There was no question about how much money do you have? Are you voting left or right? Do you come from what neighborhood? What was your original country? None of that. It was like, put on the yellow vest and you're our friend. And I noticed this because I didn't wear a yellow vest and I was not a member, just to say I'm an anthropologist, but I knew what it was all about and they knew who I was. And I'd be walking around with other yellow vests. But once they recognized who you were and knew that you were part of the movement, they immediately exchanged cell phones and Facebook posts. Immediately. That's all they had. It was Facebook and cell phone.
If one of the discontents of civilization is the breakdown of ancient patterns of connection, communal reconnection is one of the pillars of societal transformation. The sporadic No Kings protests have been spaces for a kind of political spiritual revivalism, and they are enlivening. The Yellow Vests, however, took up residence in public spaces day in, day out for weeks and months. While there together, a socio-political ecosystem emerged and evolved in layers, and they rediscovered what connects them across typical political divides. That reclamation of the physical space itself is what Ida Susser calls a commoning, which is a kind of decolonization of the political imagination. I asked Ida to break it down a bit.
So the commoning idea. You know the idea of the commons. The commons is, for example, the squares in Paris, the Place de la République, or like the square where Occupy Wall Street was. All over the United States, you found Occupy Wall Street. They took over squares in Washington, D.C., in Burlington, Vermont, in Los Angeles. They took over squares that they were occupying. But that was like commoning. It may be public space, it may be private space, but it's taking it over for collective use. And it's shared. And the way I understand commoning is it gives the population a sense of what sharing for the public good, for the collective good could be like. The social ways that you feel when you're sharing with people, when you're organizing that way, when you don't have leaders telling you what to do. And in those cases, I think we call it commoning. And when you see how much of our environment is being taken over by the chemical filth and the regression we now have, that their factories are allowed to fume as much as they want, by what happened in Flint, Michigan, with the waters being destroyed. And we want to claim back by commoning. We want to claim back our clean air, our healthcare, our housing. So it's an occupying, taking over, sharing public goods, sharing collective goods. It's kind of between the public and the private. Not everything people take over is public because they believe that it still belongs to them and that they should be making this statement that it belongs to them, because a lot of stuff has been taken away from us. And then the other side of that is it's a dream. I wrote a lot about a unified vision, a dream, a utopian vision, that you believe that you have this right. And the more people begin to share that vision, the more that we can get that right, the more that we can get more than we had before. So like there was a demonstration for the pension they were taking. Macron decided it's part of taking away government entitlements. Nobody's ever been able to do it. Like Reagan tried it, he gave up. Trump hasn't done it yet. So Macron decided he was going to do it. But there were so many demonstrations in his first term that he could not do it, and he had to give it up. In his second term, he decided that what he would do was change the date of retirement from 62 to 64. Well, the way that 90% of the people in France, all the media even recognize this, they saw that as stealing the 2 years that they had paid for in their pension payments. They pay every year taxes and pensions. Imagine if you thought you were going to retire at 62 and you were going to volunteer to teach children how to do computers, or you were going to volunteer to keep the water of the Hudson clean, or whatever you were going to do. And suddenly you were told you've lost that 2 years of your retirement. You've lost it. Even though you paid your pension money all your life, you worked all your life, you're no longer, it's going to go away from you. It's going to go away. You're losing 2 years. They saw it as steal. And the way youth people, you think young people, why did they care? Young people said, you're stealing our futures. You're stealing our futures. So that was a unified vision that the French had, that they were entitled to their retirement in 62. But then there were other people, the Union, the CGT, and various other groups called for retirement at 60. And that's what I call the utopian vision. Like already it was 62. It had been 60, but it had been put up to 62 like 50 years ago. So the CGT says, give us our 60. That is a creative vision. It's more than just occupying to stop. What I'm saying is that people are occupying to create a creative vision. And that creative vision comes out of living together in a cabin, commoning, being in the streets together, talking to each other, getting to know your neighbors and your people that agree with you and talk with you all day. And these ideas don't come from just me or just you. They come from people joining together and thinking things through together through their own practical experience, so that, you know, instead of saying keep 62, you can say we want 60. And they were all in my market where I go shopping and all that in France, Saturday morning market, they were all wearing buttons saying 60. That's it, 60, nothing more.
This would be a good moment to pause for those who find raising the retirement age just a couple of years on state pensions to be a reasonable way to manage budget deficits. It can sound like good math on the surface, but let's look a little deeper. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. popularized a phrase that might apply here: socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. For example, while the government tried to frame the diesel tax as a green necessity, the Yellow Vests pointed out that it was a regressive tax hitting the rural poor, while taxes on luxury fuel for yachts and airplanes were untouched. And as Ida Susser has already pointed out, less than 25% of the diesel tax would even go to environmental causes. Regarding pensions, the Yellow Vests argue that reasonability depends on where you look for the money. Their vision of 60 isn't just a dream, it's a demand to prioritize people over capital. They argued that while productivity has skyrocketed since the 1970s, the gains from that productivity went to shareholders and CEOs, not into the pension fund. And there is a massive gap in France between the wealthy and the working class regarding healthy life expectancy. A laborer's body is often broken by 60 years of age in a way that, say, a lawyer or a stockbroker's is not. For a construction worker, 64 isn't just 2 more years. It's a death sentence for their actual retirement years. So they proposed a pathway to their utopian fix of dropping the retirement age to 60. They suggested it could be funded by, say, taxing high-frequency stock trading, reinstating the wealth tax that Macron had cut, and increasing corporate contributions. Economists estimate that the abolition of the wealth tax by Macron cost the French Treasury about the equivalent of $3.5 billion per year. While that doesn't cover the entire pension deficit, it's a massive down payment. For a protester, it's hard to hear there is no money for a 60-year-old's retirement when the government just handed a multi-billion-dollar gift to the top 1% of the population. Sound familiar? If you refuse to accept this kind of a scenario as reasonable, you are on your way to visionary change. Ida asserts that there is great power in the simple act of people getting together. By just hanging out and sharing, people can collectively break the spell of the dominant narrative and awaken.
So this is what I call a creative vision, as opposed to just stop, you're hurting us, which I think you need to do. But we need to also be transformative. And the Commons allows people to think through being transformative together.
But being transformative comes with a price. The status quo never changes without sacrifices on the part of the people. And it is becoming abundantly clear that the forces used against demonstrators are increasing in ferocity.
You know, the Yellow painted slogans on their backs because people don't want their faces photographed. They began to paint messages. It's really crucial. Hundreds of messages on their backs. There are books of these, and I put some in my book. But what they were saying is, we understand police violence now because we have been attacked by the police. They had never been attacked in the provinces. The police were on their side. Friendly gendarme, friendly policeman, ask him the way, that kind of policeman. Suddenly they were attacked by the police in Paris.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yes.
Because this is, again, I want people to be able to picture themselves in the shoes of these movements, to understand what we may have to go through if we want to right the path that this world is on. It's not going to come easy. It's going to be hard either way. So choose the hard that you want. So describe the hard that the Yellow Vests endured.
So they ran into Paris on November 17th. Very friendly to the police, coming from the rural areas. And suddenly in Paris, the police were armed with what we call LBDs and laser guns and grenades and tear gas. Yellow Vests and many, many Parisian demonstrations believe that if you hurt property, not people, that if it's not violence against people, it's violence against property that they think is wrong or that they disagree with. They had certain targets, for example, McDonald's. For 30 years, the French have hated McDonald's, and they break the windows at McDonald's. They break the windows of the banks. They break the windows of the fancy, elegant shopping centers. You can be very shocked by this, but that is something that French demonstrations do, more than American demonstrations. The French police, they do stop those people, but under the previous administration before Macron, they had never had these laser guns. But just before Macron was elected, the police, they got more flexibility about how they could shoot. And they also got these LBDs, which when they shoot an LBD, people lose their hands, they lose their eyes, they lose their feet. And people have been killed by the LBDs. They began to recognize that the police were not on their side, and that to come to Paris, as they did in what they called wild marches running down the streets, they were going to be arrested, wounded, and put in jail for weeks on end. like I told you, they'd never even been to a demonstration. So this is something very, very upsetting and traumatizing. But people kept going. And it became, after about a year, if you put a yellow vest on in one of the Paris streets, you would be arrested. The police would just arrest you, like, immediately. They could arrest you beforehand.
I have to say that I did find myself shocked by this destruction of property during protests. So I dug into it a little bit. In the United States, protest is generally seen as a form of symbolic speech, a way to express an opinion. In France, though, protest is seen as an exercise of power and a way to physically check the state, which sounds kind of intriguing. French political identity is, of course, rooted in the Revolution of 1789. While the United States Constitution emphasizes life, liberty, and property, the French revolutionary tradition suggests that if the state breaks the social contract, the people have a moral right to make the country ungovernable. And in this tradition, property destruction isn't viewed as random violence, but as a measured escalation. If the government refuses to listen to a peaceful march, the movement escalates to property damage to show the state that the peace is a privilege that can be revoked. You see this clearly with the Yellow Vests who had been peacefully occupying roundabouts outside of Paris, but no one paid attention, so they escalated. You rarely see French protesters burning down a neighbor's house, but they target symbols of the state or capital, such as toll booths to protest the diesel tax, bank facades to oppose neoliberalism, or luxury storefronts to denounce the cancellation of the wealth tax. Personally, I'm not so sure about destroying property, but I do know that strikes and boycotts hit effectively at the heart of capital. Property destruction has been a normal part of French protest, but now the tide is turning dark, just as it is in the United States. Law enforcement is becoming militarized, and we can learn from how the Yellow Vests ultimately responded.
So that it became a very dangerous thing to be a Yellow Vest. So after that, first, they recognized that Black Lives Matter. When those guys were killed, they were killed in ways that the Yellow Vests began to understand prison and police violence. But also, they joined the union movements with singing songs. Instead of wearing the Yellow Vest, you would go in a union demonstration, and I would hear the Yellow Vest song, and everybody would start singing it. And it was a way of showing their support without wearing the Yellow Vest, and it was being sung through all the union marches and all the May Day marches. Some of the Yellow Vest songs are kind of integrated into social justice movements in France.
This song, called On est là, means we are here, and it became the unofficial anthem of the Yellow Vests and has since been used in almost every major French strike and protest, including the massive pension demonstrations in 2023 and 2024. It has become so iconic that in 2023, opposition members of the French Parliament actually stood up and sang it directly at government ministers during the pension debates, an act that absolutely stunned the serious political establishment. Coming up next, Ida shows how the Yellow Vests work to both reclaim the meaning of the common good and the physical territory that undergirds it. You are listening to the Apocalyptic Supperclub, nourishment for dire times. The news often drains us with too much of a bad thing. What's wrong, who's victimized, and why we're failing. It's rare to hear stories that feed our capacity to see ourselves as potent agents of change. Well, America and France have always had a revolutionary connection, and anthropologist Ida Susser's new book about the Yellow Vests of France is being called an inspiration and a field guide for social change. Ida shares here how strong social movements organize for the common good and refuse the powerful, ever-present principle of divide and conquer.
Were they right or left? Are they pushing France into what I call exclusivism? In other words, against immigrants, against people of color, against Jews if it's anti-Semitic. Not inclusive, that's what I call the left, but exclusive, that's shutting out anyone from entitlements. And Marine Le Pen stands for that. That's exclusive. So they want immigrants not to have rights of citizenship. Even if you were born there, you don't get those rights if your parents were not citizens. They want to cut people out of their rights to health care. That's what I call exclusive, and that's what I call right wing, because these things get blurred, what's right, what's left. What I call inclusive is universal entitlements, universal. And the Yellow Vests could have gone either way. They went towards universal. They went towards supporting the state. What I call Trump, he says the state is a swamp. That's exclusive. That's extreme right. The state is a swamp. Don't give money to the state. Certainly don't give money to people of color or immigrants. It's built on the exclusive racist whisper. Whereas the Yellow Vests were calling for the reinvention of the state, the transformation of social justice to include everybody. And that's what thresholding allowed them to do. And that's where they were going. And that's why I say that in the end, I do not think that the Yellow Vests moved France in a right-wing direction, extreme right. Within a year or two, they were definitely part of the unions and moving to inclusive fighting for retirement benefits, for healthcare, for housing, for transportation. And it was for everyone. And they never picked up on the anti-immigrant, anti-color whispers of the far right. They never picked up on that.
Well, the only thing I think that endures in the long run is the deep, deep human desire for freedom, for rights. It's just every human being wants that thing. And so I really want to get into how they are achieving results. Some people have called your book a field guide. What's the field guide method? What are the things that they did? How did they achieve their ends? And how would we import that to the United States? And it might already be happening here, but let's talk about that.
Okay, so of course it's built on theoretical arguments that come out of the 1930s, but I'm not going to talk about that, because you can go read those theoretical arguments. But what I talk about is the side of the commons, which comes from ideas of three things. One is movement around like unions and people get collective healthcare, collective education. The people that work in those fields joining with the people that use those services, like teachers and parents getting together to build the schools, or patients and doctors getting together to defend the Affordable Care Act. So that's what I see as commons number one, including unions like fighting for your retirement benefits, including women's issues particularly. I think it's really, really important to see how women were so central. They were the most women in the Yellow Vests ever been in French demonstrations. And they were so much focused on, they had to take their kids to school. They had to drive their kids to school. They had to find healthcare for their kids. All these things that were being cut back. All of those are in what I would call the first commons that people are organizing around, which would include unions. It would include parties that are fighting for those things. It doesn't leave them out. The first commons fights for all those things. In 2011 in Wisconsin, the people of Wisconsin took over the Capitol, and it was the firemen and the people who were worried about fires. It was the policemen and the people who need protection. It was the healthcare workers and the patients. And they occupied the capital of Wisconsin and shut down the government and got a new election, So this is something the US knows about. And I call that the first commons. The second commons is land and water and space. So it comes out of like you walk down the street. We all have a right to walk down the street. We all have a right to hang out and sit in the squares and the parks, we hope, unless they privatize them. But we believe we do. If they privatize Central Park, we'll go and sit in it, right? So this is like urban space and the rights to share space together. And the ways in which in New York you could look at that is when there's been these murders of people of color in certain areas in New York, they've been shot. And that is the opposite of the right to urban space. You know, when you're in the spaces that are regarded as rich spaces and you don't look rich and you get shot, that kind of thing. So what the second commons is about, the right to the city, the right to the spaces of the streets. So that's the second commons. And the third commons is creative vision. It's everything we dream of. It's building visions. So those are the three commons, and I see them as crucial to any kind of movement. So creative vision would be like the musicians came to the Yellow Vests, and the theater actors and comedians and marched with the Yellow Vests. They invented a group called the Yellow Submarines. I loved it. The academics joined the Yellow Vests, many, as well as the truck drivers and nurses, etc. So the generation of a creative vision, I see that as the third commons. And I see these things as interacting. So yes, we may take over space like Yellow Vests took over the Place de la République or the streets. At the same time, they worked in the unions. So they worked with the first commons. The nurses were part of the Yellow Vests, but they also had their own picketing outside their own clinics where they were all being fired or they were losing services. I had grandmothers who were in these marches because their daughters were teachers or nurses and didn't have enough help. And then there were patients who had been cancer patients who felt they hadn't been looked after in the hospitals because of all the cutbacks. So it's like bringing together all these different aspects. And that's the three commons, generating a vision of how we can transform society.
It's easy to look at the news and feel like nothing ever changes, but effectiveness isn't always measured by which laws were passed. It's about shifting the common sense of a nation. The Yellow Vests broke the echo chamber of divide and conquer. Because the protests started and grew from where people live, it forced those of different ideologies, left, right, and non-aligned, to talk face to face for months. And this created a shared class consciousness that bypassed the corporate media's narrative. And they stopped being voters and started being neighbors with a common goal. Most American protests are one and done. A big march on a Saturday and everyone goes home. But the Yellow Vests showed up consistently for over a year, and this permanent state of mobilization made it impossible for the government to simply wait it out. It forced the state to expend massive amounts of political and police capital, eventually leading to the great national debate, a massive, if flawed, attempt by the government to respond to the public's grievances. And by coming together and engaging with strategic disruptions, they became a massive glitch in a system that had become too comfortable ignoring the working class. They proved that while politicians may not listen to petitions, they must listen to economic halts. The most immediate effectiveness of the movement was its ability to force economic concessions. President Macron, who initially refused to budge, eventually canceled the fuel tax and announced an increase in the minimum wage and tax breaks for pensioners. Perhaps the most effective thing the Yellow Vests did was destroy the myth of the inevitable neoliberal future. They proved that if a government tries to solve problems on the backs of the poor while protecting the rich, the public has the power to make the country ungovernable. Reading and listening to the stories of those who have the courage and stamina to stand up to power can lend us the strength to stand up ourselves. The story of the Yellow Vests of France is worth studying and celebrating. Enormous sacrifices were made and gains achieved, but the modern fight against tyranny is taking on a long arc. If you would like to learn from the Yellow Vests and steep yourself in Ida Susser's deep anthropological lens on resistance movements across the globe, she is offering her book, The Yellow Vests and the Fight for Democracy, for free.
This is a book about the commons. It's a book about commoning. It's a book about collective interest. And so I really, really, really wanted it to be available to everyone. So I used my research money to pay for it to be free online to everyone. and it's published by Routledge. So you go to the book and you'll see right there on the Routledge page in Amazon, wherever you find it, there's a thing which says download for free. And you can download the entire book as many times as you like, send it to your friends. Really, my aim was for people to read it. The reason I wrote this book was to help us see our way through what we're all dealing with today. And it's free online.
So how do we stop being spectators, largely just watching the pendulum swing of history, and start becoming, as Ida Susser sees us, as the protagonists of our own history, capable of seizing the momentum of that pendulum for ourselves? Well, read her book and find out. The link to the free download can be found in our show notes at ksqd.org and on all major podcast platforms. I'm Christine Barrington, and this has been the Apocalyptic Supper Club, Nourishment for Dire Times, produced in partnership with KSQD Community Radio in Santa Cruz, California. For more inspiration and links to podcasts and articles to help you meet this dire moment, visit apocalypticsupperclub.com. Music was Star of Lisa, Taodella, and Cabernet from Blue Dot Sessions.